Our guest this week is Rohan Patel, who was formerly Vice President of Global Public Policy at Tesla, where he worked for 8 years. At Tesla, Patel worked on regulations and legislation such as the Inflation Reduction Act, and was also in charge of selecting sites for gigafactories, visiting multiple countries around the world. Before Tesla, Patel worked on climate and energy policy for former President Barack Obama. In this interview, Patel talks about what the administration of Donald Trump will mean for electric vehicles, the future of the Inflation Reduction Act, batteries from China, and more.
We're sat here at Benchmark Week, just a week after the US election, with President-elect Donald Trump and a new administration coming in the coming months. Overall, what do you think a Trump victory means for EVs in the US?
Well, I think there's going to be a deceleration, no doubt. There's a couple of reasons for that. Now, this is not a net negative for EVs, battery materials, battery cells, industrial policy generally, but there's going to be some deceleration. In part, there's a carrot and stick. You've got the IRA, other things, but the IRA, big set of carrots, and you've got pollution standards and pollution regulations. Trump is likely to really slash those pollution standards and those fundamental carbon-based policies. So if you have automakers that are, let's say, making compliance cars, making cars to that standard, some of those automakers will drop their production. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of both tariff-related measures and industrial policy-related measures within the IRA, tax credits, grants, and loans and the like. Some of that stuff will stay, and it kind of remains to be seen how much, but there will be some deceleration, there's no doubt.
On the greenhouse gas emission standards, how coupled at the moment do you think EV adoption in the US so far maybe has been and will continue to be over the next few years if those are cut pretty much on day one as they could be, and as we've seen changes to those on day one in the past as well?
Yeah, so there's a lot of nuance to this question. At the highest level, Trump cannot cut the regulations. He can slow them down significantly, weaken them significantly, but there's, at least as of today, there's an imperative to regulate this pollutant, this greenhouse gas. Now, what they do in terms of revoking the California's waiver to set their own standards, both on the GHG side, they've done ZEV work. How do they think about heavy-duty vehicles in this regard? So all of these things will play into it to a degree. What I think is unknown at this point is how much better the actual delivery of product is from existing legacy, however you want to think about OEMs. And does that overcome this deceleration that we expect to see from Trump through the standards and through other processes? Will you see products that overwhelm the consumer, compel the consumer? I think Tesla's done an incredibly great job of doing just that, of overwhelming the consumer with a product that is so damn good that they're going to buy it over the BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Toyota, whatever the other comparable car might be. That's where we need to see, is that possible from some of these OEMs that to date have not been able to do that?
Yeah, is it possible for the market to stand on its own 2 feet at this early stage in a sense as well?
But we should take we should take a lot of optimism from what we've seen elsewhere. See what's happening in China. Now, yes, they had a mandate as well, but the mandate is useless at this point because that pollution standard and that mandate is no longer relevant. They're way outselling without any need. So the credit pricing is almost zero in China. That's what we should hope to see here. We should hope to see Tesla make $0 on regulatory credits. As of this point, just in the last 2 quarters, they've made, I think, $1.6 billion in regulatory credits. Much of that is from the US.
Yeah. Coming back to the IRA, with potential changes to parts of the IRA, maybe 45X in particular, do you think if those parts of the IRA are cut under a Trump administration, do you think investments that have been made over the last 4 years will maintain?
This is also a big depends. It really it depends on which sector, which material, which mineral, what tariff, all of the other policies that exist, how strong their OEM partners are in being able to absorb what might be a loss in terms of tax credit. So lots to look at there. But as a general matter, I think there's going to be a lot of positivity from Republican members of Congress about the upside in their district in terms of jobs and investment, supply chain around that, other economic development that's happening as a result of IRA-related investments, that I expect to see the Trump administration actually maybe even enhance, tweak for the better some of these policies. So it's not all lost on 45X or on some of these other regimes within the IRA.
Given at the moment, Tesla has been a large portion of the LFP being used in the US market. Potentially the tariffs already in place from the Biden administration have made that a lot less competitive as a choice. Do you think with potentially even further tariffs on top of what we currently have, LFP is now uncompetitive in the US market, having to come from abroad?
So a couple things. I think in very short order, LFP coming from China is already dead. Many of the tariffs that Trump put in place in the 301 setting stayed almost unchanged. The Biden team, quite recently actually, and it was just not that long ago, made tweaks to some of those tariffs, which were important. And I think some of those were to the benefit of the overall industry. Some were a little bit strange, but the point being, they did make some enhancements. They did not get rid of what Trump put in place. So what I think we're going to see in this realm is some real changes. There will no doubt be changes, but I think it's hard to predict exactly how those changes will be implemented over time and which companies stand to benefit. Lots and lots of advocacy that will be happening over the coming weeks on this very question.
And do you think that tariffs can add impetus to bring the supply chain to the US? Let's start with, from domestic manufacturers.
Yes, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. You can't tariff your way into industrial policy. What I think was really interesting about what we saw from Trump to Biden is that Biden said, maybe I wouldn't have been able to do this, but since Trump did it, I'm going to continue these tariffs. What's going to happen from Biden to Trump, and yet to be determined, but I think we could see a real absorption into the Trump ethos of industrial policy carrots that Biden got done. Trump may want to rebrand it, of course, as he usually does, but whether it's the IRA stuff on semiconductors and the CHIPS Act, I think this is a place of actual confluence between the two political parties in the US where it was never thought of as something that we might see both Republicans and Democrats agreeing on tariffs. Used to be anathema to the Republican ideology. Free trade was such a huge part of their platform, no longer. It used to be that Democrats generally were okay spending on these kinds of industrial policies, but Republicans were not. Looks like that also may be changing. So I think we're gonna see how much cuts the IRA absorbs and what changes, but these are nuanced and really in the weeds. Most of your players that are here at Benchmark today, they understand the various different puts and takes at Treasury, Department of Energy, OMB, all of these acronyms that exist within the US government. But these small changes can be incredibly meaningful, whether you slap a FIAC onto 45X or you put different types of Made in America restrictions, further restrictions, get rid of the leasing loophole. There are lots of different things that can happen, but they're all quite nuanced and can happen in different ways.
Yeah. And one of the things that's been coming up in conversation a lot at Benchmark Week this year has been the potential role that China can play in manufacturing within the US. If potentially that's a door that's opened up under a new administration. Do you think that's something that can be a net benefit to the US?
100%. But sadly, there's quite a bipartisan consensus on this question as well, which I think is to the detriment of the United States. There's a lot to be worried about in terms of Chinese government policy, Communist Party policy. But in terms of commercial efforts in the battery realm and battery materials realm, there's just no doubt they have been incredibly innovative. The companies in China have done some really incredible work in terms of efficiency, in terms of new materials, science, in terms of refining and processing. This is something we should want in our country as well. So whether this happens or not, I'm skeptical, because even the person that is going to be the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been quite aggressive in pushing back on even having Chinese firm IP that's part of the manufacturing process here in the US. I hope I'm wrong. I hope actually that the Trump administration opens up its thought process, learns a little from the Chinese government's approach as well, and we see a different way of thinking about Chinese company investments in the US.
We now have the potential or the likely scenario of Elon being the leader of the new Department of Government Efficiency. How should we interpret the relationship between Trump and Elon over the next administration?
No damn clue. I mean, I honestly, it's hard to know exactly how long this will be, how lasting it will be, how significant it will be. I think it's an incredibly important adventure, for sure. Every administration should be going through this very process. What regulations should be cut? What things should be cut from the government? How can we make things more efficient? What can we streamline in terms of permitting? How can we enhance our environment but also speed up our industrial deployment? Those things we should be seeing in every government, so I'm glad that they're focusing on it. How it gets enforced, how it gets rolled out, how it actually is deployed really remains to be seen. And I think the other question, not just specific to Elon, but frankly just generally, there's a lot of conflicts that exist in terms of just being on the outside of the government and advising versus being inside the government and making actual decisions. So that dynamic, we'll see it play out. Let's see how it goes over the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, being not necessarily able to take an official government position for the reasons of having to divest from current companies, and therefore being in this more advisory position. Do you think that that weakens influence to some extent, or do you think from what we've seen so far, that influence is going to be pretty strong anyway?
We don't know. Making those, so once you hit up against legal barriers, there's certain parts of the government, even for this particular sector, that actually need to be enhanced, not cut. We need to see more software engineers in certain areas of the government. We need to see more material science engineers and experts in certain parts of the government. This is important. This is important to Trump. We know that. Certainly in the last go around, it was important to him. So these are the kinds of things. It's not as simple as saying we're just going to cut 50% of the government. We're going to cut 25% of the. No, yes, there may be places where that's a concern necessary to do. You have a priority system around that. But there's also places where you need to increase the levels of spending, increase or make more efficient the use of resources. So, I'll be very curious as to see how it plays out. But that whole dynamic is quite a bit more complex than I think maybe what the public understands.
Pivoting slightly towards Tesla now. Autonomy and autonomous driving has become a really important part of the future value proposition for Tesla. It's something that we hear more on earnings calls. It's something we hear more from Elon as well. What do you think the path to kind of the regulatory approval that Tesla is hoping for next year looks like? Is there a realistic timeline there this time?
Couldn't tell you on timeline. I'm sure Tesla has its internal goals. I really don't know. But there's an important distinction here. Outside of the United States, generally speaking, there's a type approval system for safety, for vehicle safety, which means you have to submit your design concept, you have to submit your sort of checklist of items, and homologation engineers, safety engineers, are advocating and working with those government agencies. And each country has their own way of setting this up. Some countries adopt one. In Europe, you can have one type of approval agency, and then all of the other EU members adopt that. So that's the way that it's done in terms of needing permission. Here in the US, there's self-certification. Yes, there's still the checklist of things that you have to abide by, a whole range of regulations, but there's no need for submitting for regulatory approval. It's quite the opposite. Do you believe that your system is safe? Do you believe that you have a system and concept in place that works? In addition to that, in the United States, there is no regulation. There are no regulations that exist for autonomous vehicles and ADAS systems, level 2, level 3, level 4 for the SAE levels. So that doesn't exist. What they're doing today to sort of regulate is more of a enforcement authority that NHTSA has, that the Safety Approval Agency has, rather than looking at the regulations bottom up, having a research base to do that. So one of the things that's really important that we pushed for a lot while I was at Tesla was to develop that. You need legislative authority for some of these pieces. You need direction to do that. But this is very hard. Developing regulations for a ever-changing setup and developing performance standards to allow for the deployment of these vehicles writ large is really a difficult proposition. Europe and the UNECE and others are finding that out. The US really hasn't begun to develop that research base that would allow for a regulation to come into place.
And then finally, given the challenges we've talked about today, all of the complexities involved with everything that the new administration is facing and that car companies are facing now as well, how's your levels of optimism for the next 5 to 10 years of EV adoption in the US in particular?
I don't know about you. My view is that almost everyone I have spoken to, and there's some difference between the brands, but anybody I've spoken to that has been a Tesla owner, and I'm obviously in my own bubble, so there's lots of folks they're just not going back. They're not going back to when they have to drive maybe their spouse's car or somebody else's car, or they have to rent a car, they hate it not being a Tesla or not being an EV. I think we're starting to see that with other brands as well. That same level of, I love my EV. I love the way it feels. I love the performance. I love the kick. I love the instantaneous feeling that car gives you. And there's a lot of different software capacity as well with some of these cars that I think is really enhanced. So overall, it feels like it's inexorable. It's just really a matter of, in the short term and medium term, does Trump decelerate some of that growth in the US specifically? I think probably, but over time, this is a no-brainer.
And decelerated growth, still looking like growth in your view?
Still growth.
Rohan, thank you very much.
You got it.